Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak video. This is Kazu here, and today we're going to be covering the 4 new longswords added in by Title Update 1.0 from the new monsters, and basically doing a meta-analysis comparing them to the previously good raw weapons for the longsword, how they hold up, and whether or not you should be using them. So let's get straight into it with the weapons. So for those of you who haven't looked at the new longswords, we're going to have the Bazel Rooksearer, which is going to be from Seething Bazel LS. Then we're going to have the Wyvern Blade Pale, which is going to be from Silver Rathalos. Then we have the Wyvern Blade Luna from Go to Rathian. And last but not least, we have the Mergrez's Asterism, hopefully I said that correct, which is going to be from the Lucent Narga. So all of these weapons have pretty interesting stats. They have decent raw values and decent slots as well. We're going to cover individually each weapon, how they hold up against the meta for raw and the fire element respectively. So first up is the Bazel Rooksearer. This is going to be the Seething Bazel LS longsword. It has 340 raw, it's going to have a sliver of purple sharp, minus 10% affinity, 28 blast, 2 1 slots, and a level 2 rampage decoration slot. Pretty good stats. I'm also going to be showing the build that I use alongside the armor skills that I'm using with the build on screen so that you have a general idea of how I'll be performing throughout the hunt. We're just casually hunting a Rathian here. I think I kill her in around 3 minutes, and this is honestly without really trying all too much, using the Silkbind, Sakura Slash, and the Sacred Sheath combo playstyle. Really recommend it for this weapon because it has high raw. But we're going to be using Coven's Damage and DPS Overlay, which is a mod only available for PC, to monitor the damage as well as the blast proc so that I can kind of give you a comparison with the performance of this weapon and what to expect. Now, directly comparing the Rooksearer with two of the other top blast weapons, we have the Imperial Flicker Flame and the Devil's Deal from Teostra and Scorn Magnamal respectively. You can see that the Bazel Rooksearer is going to have the most raw out of all these weapons. It's going to have purple sharpness, which the Imperial Flicker Flame doesn't have. It does have a little bit of minus affinity, but we can overcome that with skills like Crit Draw or Max Might. Longsword is very efficient in terms of affinity because it can use all of the affinity skills such as Critical Eye, Maximum Might, and Crit Draw for the Sacred Sheath combo specifically. But you're going to be able to take advantage of these skills, so a loss of affinity isn't as big of a deal on this weapon as it is for some other weapon types. It does have the least blast, however, out of all the other options. So you notice when we're going to fight that even with status trigger, level 2, we're able to get a decent amount of status procs, but I honestly don't think that the blast itself is going to be making up for a large portion of damage over the course of the hunt, and we'll actually cover the numbers here. Looking at the slots, it has 2 level 1 slots, which are honestly not that good. Usually, especially with augmentation, level 1 slots on a weapon are less valuable than ever before. So that's kind of bad. The Imperial Flicker Flame has a 2 slot, and the Devil's Deal has a 3 slot and a 2 slot, which is really good. Devil's Deal can also make use of Grinder S because it has a sliver of purple and white sharpness, whereas the Rooksearer has a little bit too much white sharpness to take advantage of Grinder S skill. So overall, it's still really good because it does have the highest raw, 340 raw. It's going to have one of the highest raws of all the longswords outside of, things like the Desperate Roar Plus. So it's pretty good in most scenarios, but let's take a look at the actual damage itself. So at the end of this hunt, fighting the Rathian, we deal almost a total of 20,000 raw damage. But if we look at our blast damage, it shows 600. For some reason, it doesn't actually calculate the damage that I'm doing from the blast procs if it increased from, the previous values of high rank, which was 100 per proc. So this is 6 procs actually, and we did a total of 1440 blast damage over the course of this hunt. So that's really a pretty small percentage of our total damage. If we did about 19k damage and we did 1.4k damage with blast, that's only going to be around 8% of our total damage, which is not enough to really make for the big difference in damage when compared to using something like the Desperate Roar Plus with Grinder S or other sorts of meta builds for raw and status. Overall, I do think this weapon is competitive with the Flicker Flame and the Devil's Deal, but you are going to have to keep an eye out for the minus affinity. Make sure to either run crit draw or perhaps other skills to compensate for the loss of affinity. Next up is the Wyvern Blade Pale. This is going to be the Silver Rathalos Longsword, and as you can see, it has 300 raw attack. It has white sharpness, 30% affinity, which is very high for most longswords. It has 65 fire damage, which is pretty high element, and then it has a 2-slot and a 2-slot rampage decoration. So I'm also going to be throwing up the build on screen. We're using an elemental build with 1 level of element exploit alongside maxed out fire attack, maxed out crit element. We're getting as much elemental damage as we hopefully can, as well as having, really high base offensive skills. One thing to note is that because this weapon has 30% affinity, you only need to run 2 levels of max might, and then you're already capped at 100% affinity, assuming you can keep your stamina bar full. So you could also swap that out with Crit Eye or Crit Jaw, depending on your needs. Crit Eye would be the best in the sense that you don't have to worry about any conditional modifiers for your crit chance. But because you only need very little affinity in the base build to use alongside Wyvern Blade Pale, it does save a lot on slots. So this is going to be a great weapon if you don't have a lot of good augments yet for your armor set or a good talisman. Now, if we compare it to the other meta choices for fire element, we have the Wyvern Blade Scarlet, which is the regular Rathalos Longsword, and the Volcanic Apocalypse from Magmadron. So both of these have very high fire. We have 55 fire and 320 raw for the Wyvern Blade Scarlet. We have 310 raw and 75 fire for the Volcanic Apocalypse. So the Wyvern Blade Pale is definitely losing out in terms of raw damage. In terms of fire damage, it's an average between the two, so that's not a very big deal. The slots are all very comparable, I would say. I wouldn't really compare much of those. Same with the sharpness between the Volcanic Apocalypse and the Wyvern Blade Pale. Now, the Wyvern Blade Scarlet gets a lot of points from me because it reaches purple sharp naturally. So you can either use Protective Polish to keep that purple sharpness, or you can add points of Handicraft, although I would just recommend Protective Polish. It takes at least 3 or 4 points of Handicraft if you want to get purple sharpness on these other weapons, and that's a big hit. Purple sharpness does increase your raw damage from white to purple by about 7%, and it also increases your elemental damage. I'm not sure by how much, but I think it's going to be at least by 10%. If not, it's going to be substantially more. So that's a big loss that it doesn't have purple sharpness for me, and the raw being 20 less than, say for example, the Wyvern Scarlet Blade, or 10 less than the Volcanic Apocalypse, again, is a pretty big hit. You are making up for it with the affinity. That's going to save you a lot of slots in the build. So again, this weapon is still perfectly viable to use. However, there are just going to be a couple drawbacks in terms of that damage, but you're going to trade it off for more flexibility in the build because you don't have to build affinity. And for those of you wondering how important element damage is to the longsword, we do a Royal Ludroth hunt here just to showcase max hit zone values for the fire element. And as you can see, we do about 4,154 fire damage dealt on this kind of casual run where we're trying to do decent damage. And we do about 20,000 damage total, so that's about 20% of our total damage being fire, and I would say that's more on the high end. You would probably be doing around 15 to 20% element damage, depending on the hit zones of the monster. Alright, so next up is actually going to be the comparison of both the Wyvern Blade Luna as well as the Mergrez's Asterism, because both of these weapons are raw and poison, so they can be compared to one another directly. But since poison weapons are mainly focused on just damage output over time, we're also going to be comparing it to a straight raw weapon, the Desperate Roar Plus, which in my opinion is the top pick for raw weapons. If you're going to have a raw damage weapon that's going to be on a level which is competitive with elemental weapons, I think the Desperate Roar Plus is the closest thing you can get because it can abuse the Grinder S for plus 10 raw. So going over the stats for the Wyvern Blade Luna, we have 330 raw, we have white sharpness, we have 10% affinity, we have 39 poison damage, and then we have a 3 slot and a 2 slot rampage decoration. So overall, you can already tell this weapon is better than most of the other raw weapons baseline. Having plus 10% affinity is quite nice. It does save you on, 2 points of critical eye or 1 point of maximum light in the build. And then it has 39 poison, which, as you can see with the current build that we're using, synergizes very well with foray and status trigger. Once you roll through an attack and you proc status trigger, then you can just do a Sacred Silkbind or a counter. You can inflict poison on the monster right off the bat, and then you're gonna have a pretty good uptime on your foray for extra damage and affinity. Comparing that to the Magretz's Asterism, we can see that we have 330 raw, a sliver of purple, and a little bit of white sharpness, no affinity bonus, poison of 14 damage, and then we have a 4 slot, a 2 slot, and the level 1 rampage decoration. So for this weapon, because it has a sliver of purple and white sharpness, we're using it with the Grinder S skill, which is going to give us 10% bonus raw damage when we increase our sharpness levels back from blue to purple. So that's honestly quite huge for the weapon. We're going to get a huge amount of damage output out of that, and we're using it with crit draw level 3 so that we can combo it with Sacred Sheath, which the Spirit Release attack, all 3 hits will get the affinity bonus from critical draw. So we're going to get some huge damage out of this, as you can see here. And overall, this weapon is really solid. It's got really good slots. The one thing holding it back is going to be the level 1 rampage decoration. If it was a level 2 rampage decoration, I honestly think this weapon could be potential meta for raw weapons. However, because it's missing out on the level 2 rampage decoration, you're going to have to use an augment to increase the rampage decoration slot. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use an anti-species deco, which is going to give you 5% increased raw. So that's kind of a big hit to the weapon, but other than that, it's pretty comparable to the Gold Rathian longsword. You definitely have less poison, so that's why I'm not using this with status trigger or any sort of status poison build, because the poison buildup by itself is just a little bit too low for my taste. While both of those longswords are honestly very viable and great choices to have for raw damage and poison, we are going to be doing a meta analysis, so we have to be a little bit strict on them and give them a comparison with the Desperate Roar Plus, which in my opinion is the best raw damage longsword at the moment. This is mainly due to the fact that it has 350 raw, but also because it has purple sharpness with very little white sharpness, so you can use it with Grinder S, as you can see on screen, to synergize with the raw damage of the build. We're already going to be having an increased amount of raw, so we get more value out of attack boost 7, and then on top of that we get even more raw out of the Grinder S skill. So overall, we're dealing tons of damage, and the poison damage from the other 2 weapons would have to make up for the difference in the loss of damage from the Desperate Roar for those to be viable choices over it. So let's take a look at that. So to do the damage calculation, we're going to be using an EFR calculator by Chaotically Lawful. I've actually used this damage calculator before in a previous build guide video, and if you haven't seen it before, basically it's going to just be a damage calculator where you throw in your weapon stats, your bonuses, and then your armor skills, and it'll give you a display raw. It'll calculate effective raw based on your affinity, and then the total damage that you will do based on the motion value of the attack that you want to input the info for. So 250 is the motion value of the last hit of the Spirit Release attack. That's what I kind of like to check for, first, because I mainly use Sacred Sheath combos, so I want to know what the max damage I'm going to be dealing is in a single hit. And if we have the Desperate Roar Plus, that's 350 raw with minus 15% affinity. And then these are our baseline skills for the armor set. This is not accounting for Grinder, though we will look into that in just a sec. So as you can see, because we have the minus % affinity, our effective affinity with Wex is only 35. However, if we use crit draw 3, then for the Sacred Sheath combo, we actually have 60% affinity. So if I throw in, it's not going to be 60%, it's going to be 45 because it's minus 45 from the Tigrex weapon. You can see our effective raw is 920, and our total damage on crit is going to be about 2.3k, which is very high. So now we can compare this to the Gold Rathian longsword, or either one. You know, they both have 330 raw. The affinity, we're just going to say it's going to be maxed out for the purposes of this demonstration, because they don't have negative affinity. So if you use any form of crit draw or max might, you can easily cap out your affinity on the weapons. You're only going to have white sharpness for the Rathian one. So your EFR here is going to be 846. And your total damage on the last hit of the Spirit Release attack is going to be 2.1k. So that's a loss of 200 damage on the final hit, and we're losing, you know, about 100 EFR, which is quite significant. So the poison would have to make up for the difference in the loss of raw. Same for the Narga Kugel weapon. We're going to bump it up to purple sharpness, and now we have 891 EFR. And our total damage is going to be 2.2k. So this is going to be a lot closer to the Desperate Roar Plus. And again, if it didn't have the level 1 Rampage decoration slot, I actually think this weapon could contend against the Desperate Roar because it has the 4 slot and the 2 slot. So it's far more flexible and you could fit in more skills with that weapon. Again, one thing I didn't mention about the Desperate Roar Plus is that it doesn't have any slots whatsoever, any regular slots. It does have the 2 slot decoration, which is the most important thing, but it doesn't have any regular slots. So the Gold Rathian and the Lucent Narga Kugel are going to be more flexible for your build if you don't have good augments or a good talisman. But yeah, that's going to be the damage comparison. If we throw on Grinder level 3, boom, we bump up to 980 with the Lucent Narga Kugel weapon, which is quite nice. We're almost at 1000 EFR. But if we switch over to the Desperate Roar, then I throw the affinity at 60. Actually, no, it'd be 45. Boom, we're at over 1000 EFR. And this isn't even with the attack boost augment. So once we throw in the attack boost augment, we're at 360 raw. Boom, we're at 1000 EFR. If we have red spirit gauge, we're at 1160 EFR. If we throw on adrenaline, we're at almost 1500 EFR, and we're dealing 3676 damage on our Spirit Release attack, which is just insane. That's assuming that, you know, the monster has like perfect hit zone values and everything is going as planned, maximizing your damage buffs. But that's kind of the reason why I think the Desperate Roar Plus is so good. It has just outlandish damage that actually can catch up and meet with the elemental damage builds, because pretty much those are going to be the real meta compared to the raw builds. However, this one is very competitive, and I think speedrunners might actually use the Desperate Roar Plus. I've seen it being used actually in speedruns prior to Title Update 1, so we'll see if that still remains the same. Okay, so now on screen, we just captured a Tigrex using the Wyvern Blade Luna, which is a Gold Rathian longsword. So we're going to go check the numbers right now. And you can see we did about 2k damage with poison and 20k damage with physical. So that's roughly 10% of our damage being dealt as poison damage. That for sure could have been a little bit more optimal. I could have gotten more procs of status trigger throughout the hunt and maybe done like 1000 more extra damage with poison damage. So you could get around 10 to 15% damage dealt as poison in a short hunt. The number will probably be higher if you're in a longer hunt, you know, 10 to 15 minutes long. You'll be getting more benefits out of poison if you can consistently proc it, because it does a fixed amount of damage per second. So the longer the fight is, the more damage you're doing with poison. With that being said, though, it does make up for the difference in EFR if you're not accounting for Grinder S with the Desperate Roar. We had about an 8% difference in EFR from 840 with the Luna to 920 with the Desperate Roar. So overall, it's totally a viable option to pick for raw weapons if you don't want to focus on elemental builds, anything like that. I think the Golden Luna and the Murget Asterism are both pretty decent choices. You can't go wrong with either one, but just keep in mind that if it does come to min-maxing and optimal levels of DPS, both are going to fall short to the Desperate Roar. It's just not going to be by that significant enough of a margin for me to dissuade you from using either one of these weapons. So yeah, that's going to be it for our meta-analysis. Essentially, all the weapons are decent enough. I do have some qualms with the Silver Rathalos longsword just because its raw is low, and a longsword is a very raw focused weapon. However, the 30% affinity of that weapon does more than make up for the flexibility in building options, and all of these are really good regardless of what kind of augments you get, regardless of what kind of talisman you have. They're very flexible weapons. Most of them, or all of them, have good affinity except for the Bazel Geese one, which has minus 10% affinity, which is not a big deal at all. And then the plus 10% affinity and the plus 30% affinity from the Gold Rathian and Silver Rathalos weapons are even better because they actually save you slots. You don't have to build as much affinity on either one of those weapons. Okay, so that's going to be it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed the content and found it informational. If you did, please give the video a like, leave a comment, or subscribe. It helps the channel, and I did put a lot of time in to actually try out these weapons as well as check the damage values to kind of figure out if they're worth it or not. It's really hard. It's kind of arbitrary to really look at the damage numbers for poison and blast, things like that, and even checking the elemental damage numbers. It was just a little bit too much of a pain for me to check the fire elemental damage numbers, so I didn't compare that in game. But overall, you can see they do compensate for the loss in EFR compared to like some of the best raw weapons. So I hope you guys do appreciate the effort put into these videos. And yeah, we're actually going to be looking at the armor sets from Title Update 1 as well. That will be coming out shortly, hopefully in the next couple days if I can get around to it. I didn't actually expect to spend this much time analyzing the weapons from Title Update 1, but all of them are really cool. So I think it was well worth the time to take a look at each one of them and not necessarily dismiss them just because I'm so biased with the Desperate Roar Plus. But yeah, again, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.